Thucydides of Athens wrote the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. So begins one of the earliest works, if not the first work, of critical historiography. Thucydides' account of the greatest war of his lifetime. Now, we don't know an enormous amount about Thucydides. He says a few things. There are some unreliable ancient biographies. We know he was born in the middle of the 5th century BCE into an upper-class family in Athens. As a member of the Athenian elite, he served as one of the Athenian generals during the long war between Athens and Sparta, often known as the Peloponnesian War. It's not an enormously successful spell as a general. He's sent on a mission to relieve the city of Amphipolis in northern Greece from a Spartan attack. He doesn't arrive in time, and the result is he's sent into exile by the Athenian assembly as a punishment for his failure. Now, the failure of Thucydides' military career is arguably the making of him as a historian. He takes the opportunity to gather evidence for the work he's now decided to write. He talks to all the people on different sides, he gathers their stories so that he can compare them and try to get at the truth of what really happened. Thucydides' history is proclaimed by later generations as a pioneering work in critical historiography, precisely because of his insight that different people see things in different ways, that they will offer a different account of events, and so the only way to be sure of what happened is not to accept the first story you hear, but to compare different stories, to try to get at the truth as what lies behind them. And it's for this reason that Thucydides' work has continued to be read, continued to be praised, even as a model for how history should be written. An example of the task of the true historian. He's even proclaimed, especially in the 19th century, as someone who's invented modern history 2,500 years before anyone else does. Now, there are many ways in which Thucydides' history is not at all modern. It doesn't fit our expectations of a professional work of history today. And we're going to be looking at one example of a passage in Thucydides which looks very unmodern. But in many respects, the idea he offers about the historian's task, and above all, the emphasis on the need for criticism and analysis, these can still be taken as an inspiring example. But Thucydides is not only seen as a historian, he is also seen as a pioneer of political theory, as someone who has not just described the events of the war and the workings of politics, but someone who has analysed them, who's tried to get at the underlying principles, and someone indeed who can offer broader lessons that can be applied not just to the particular events that he describes, but to similar events in the future. His great claim, why should someone find his work useful? Because it will help them understand not just what has happened, but what will in the future resemble the events of the past. Because, he says, of the human thing. Because people tend to repeat the same mistakes, think in the same sorts of ways. So Thucydides, not just as a historian, but as a political theorist, a master of international relations, an analyst of strategy. For all these reasons, he continues to be read and discussed and cited. So to the particular passage in Thucydides' work that we're interested in, what's known as the Melian dialogue. Now, to put this in context, we're in the middle of the 30 Years' War between Athens and Sparta. We're actually in a lull. The two sides have signed a truce They are for the moment not actively fighting one another, but instead they're busy trying to gain advantage elsewhere. 416 BCE, an Athenian fleet turns up at the city of Melos, which is, at least officially, neutral and has had certain dealings in the past with the Spartans. The Athenians turn up and demand that the Melians surrender on pain of being destroyed. The leaders of the Melians ask to speak to them and plead for mercy. The Athenians are basically unimpressed, so eventually the Melians decide to resist, even though they know that this will almost certainly lead to their defeat and destruction, which is what eventually happens. What we are offered in Thucydides' account is the dialogue between the leaders of the Melians and the Athenians. Now, this is clearly fictional. Thucydides couldn't possibly have heard what the two sides said. It's rather that he invents what it was appropriate for them to say in that situation, which is something he does elsewhere in his work. It's one of the ways in which Thucydides' history looks very unmodern at times, that actually he puts words into the mouths of speakers. He uses characters to present their ideas and to present the situation at that time. We can see it, if nothing else, as a way of bringing events to life. In the Melian dialogue, he presents in this dramatic manner the opposing ideas and philosophies of the Athenians and the Melians. Now, this doesn't look much like history to us. To be fair to Thucydides, he's in the process, we could say, of inventing history. It's not that there's a model he can rely on. We can see perhaps echoes of Greek tragedy. The fact that a key part of many Greek plays is what's known as the agone scene. The struggle, the contest, the exchange of views between different characters, the fighting out of ideas. So that's one way of understanding what we've got in the Melian dialogue, the dramatic presentation of two radically different ways of thinking about power and justice. Now, the Melian dialogue has arguably been the most influential, the most cited part of Thucydides' whole history. It's understood in quite different ways. Some readers have seen this as Thucydides' own statement about how he understood the world, his fundamental theory of international relations. This is a world of anarchy. Justice, as the Athenians say, applies only to those with equal power. There's no room for ethics, there's no room for idealism, rather this is about the rule of the stronger. Now, this interpretation, which is often called realism within international relations, is foundational as one way of understanding not just ancient Greece, but the world in general. The Melian dialogue, according to this interpretation, is regularly cited as helping us understand situations wherever a great power confronts a lesser one, whenever we've got this sort of unequal balance. And it's also offered as a justification of what can be called realpolitik, that states should have a deliberate policy of seeing things solely in terms of the balance of power and the rational calculation of advantage. But of course, that's not necessarily what Thucydides himself intended. It's worth keeping in mind that the claims about the power of the stronger are not the words of Thucydides himself, but of one set of characters. There's no reason to assume that he agreed with the Athenians. We can see him rather presenting the attitude of the Athenians as a way of identifying the problems with their worldview. And if we look at the Melian dialogue in the wider context of his history, it's worth noting that shortly after destroying Melos, the Athenians effectively destroy themselves by embarking on an absurdly over-ambitious expedition to attack a city in Sicily, which brings them to disaster. Equally, Thucydides' portrayal of the Melians may be sympathetic, but in a lot of ways, he's showing how their views are equally problematic. They argue themselves into a self-defeating defiance. They doom themselves to destruction because of the way that they respond to the Athenians' aggression. We can see this then not as Thucydides' claim that the world is harsh and realist theory is the only way of understanding it, but instead we can see this as a kind of game theory. How do different sides respond to one another? Or even as a kind of psychology. How do the strong think? How do the strong present their views? What kinds of arguments do they offer? And how do the weak respond? So it's precisely the drama, it's precisely the clash between two incompatible perspectives that makes this passage so very powerful and influential.